Hello, archaeologists, anti-fascists, and those at the crossroads of the two. If you've noticed manosphere influencers enthusing about the Paleolithic, the Bronze Age, or classical antiquity, if you've wondered why Patriotic Alternative take field trips to prehistoric monuments, if you're recommended reels about Athala runes and Uthark theories, most importantly, if you're committed to combating the far right and the ways they use heritage and pseudo-archaeology to their advantage, this may be the place for you. We are Archaeologists Resisting Far Right Appropriation, ARFA for short, an early career researcher-led, UK-based organising group committed to challenging rising misuse and misrepresentation of the past by the far right. This project is in its early stages, but we seek to network and coordinate with concerned researchers and members of the public to respond to far right appropriation through academic research, public-facing resources, and activism. This video is the first in our seminar series, where we platform researchers documenting and designing radical responses to the far right appropriation of archaeology. We're incredibly grateful to these researchers for volunteering their time and expertise for free to share accurate critical information with the public on what's happening and what to do about it. We're grateful to Dr Lorna Richardson, an incredible public archaeologist, most of all, for being the first to do so. In just a few seconds, there'll be an intro about Lorna that leads into her seminar. For more information on Lorna and the project, check the link in our bio. Enjoy!
Okay, there we go. Now to get started properly, we all have to express our gratitude to Dr. Lorna Richardson for coming here today. She is going to be presenting on a brand new paper, In Our Blood, Archaeology and Indigeneity in the British National Party's magazine Identity. For any of you who aren't aware, which I imagine most of you are, Lorna lectures on critical digital media, digital storytelling and archaeology at the University of East Anglia, and explores the use of academic knowledge by non-experts, and is known for her incisive and politically engaged contributions to feminist and public archaeology. So we're incredibly excited to have her along today. Without further ado, I will hand over the reins to Lorna, and I hope you all enjoy.
Okay. So most of you probably do already know me, but if you don't, I work at UEA, and I have slipped down from the higher echelons of teaching archaeology to digital media at the moment. But this is some research that I've been working on for the last year, and these are the results of research I've been doing at the Searchlight Archive in the University of Northampton and the University of Cambridge and LSE archives. And I want to start with reflecting on what happened last year from the 30th of July to the 7th of August, where there was 29 anti-immigration protests that took place across the UK in places like London, Nottingham, Rotherham, Middlesbrough, Bolton, Belfast, and so on. And we can all remember it being on the news. They were ignited by the news of the tragic death of 3 children in Southport. The far right were heavily involved in the propagation of conspiracy theories around that horrific tragedy, and were swiftly circulating incitement to riot, incitement to desecrate mosques, desecrate graves. It started as anti-refugee protests and sort of declined into violence. There was civil unrest, looting and arson and so on. And many of the people that were involved in those riots included members of the former Islamophobic English Defence League, neo-fascist group Britain First, the neo-Nazi British movement, and Patriotic Alternative. And if you could move to the next slide. Patriotic Alternative, if you haven't heard of them, are in a bit of decline now, post the 2024 riots, but they're led by a chap called Mark Collett. Mark Collett is a protege of the BNP. He was in the BNP as a younger man, and Patriotic Alternative presents itself is a fascist organisation, and it presents itself as protecting the white indigenous majority of British people. Each year, including this photograph here, which is from the 12th of July last year, they climbed to the top of Mam Tor, which is in the Peak District, which is also Late Bronze Age, Early Iron Age fort. And they have done for the last 5 years, gone up there and held up this banner that says, usually in one form or another, of White Lives Matter, you shall not replace us. So they make this journey every year. They have a camp there, and they make it explicit that they are owning their heritage. They're part of this indigenous white heritage, that this land is their land and these hill forts are their hill forts. So this choice of climbing and waving this banner in a few days in the midst of riots throughout the UK, it's purposeful. It's not a coincidence. Prehistory matters to these types of people. We could have the next slide, please. And as you can see from some of the stuff that you can download from Patriotic Alternative's website, this is explicitly about ancestry. It's explicitly about the relationship between the people of the present day and the past. It's explicitly about the Great White Replacement theory, the theory that which is repeated everywhere in newspapers as well as in far-right fascist propaganda, that the white indigenous people of Britain are going to be outbred by immigrants. So could we have the next slide, please? And PA regularly do organised protests. They go out and lobby outside hotels with immigrants staying in them. They push leaflets through people's doors. They are heavily active where I live here in East Anglia. There is a big PA group that works out of Norwich, and they're regularly posting leaflets about immigrants through some of the most deprived areas of Norwich, and they focus heavily on other places in the UK that are deprived. They're looking to split communities. Could we have the next slide, please? The kind of stuff that they are talking about in Patriotic Alternatives example of this idea of indigeneity and white supremacy is unfortunately nothing that hasn't now made its way to the front pages of newspapers. And this is an article that was in last week's Telegraph, I think last week or the week before's Telegraph. And it talks about the relationship between current populations and historic populations through the idea of DNA testing, through the concept of the relationship between people today and their DNA, which is an incredibly strange and concerning way of approaching how we talk about national history and immigration. But unfortunately, some of these ideas have spilt over into everyday life. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, this isn't the only example that exists of this type of appropriation of the past for the far right. And there are thousands upon thousands of opportunities for people to harness the power of social media to discuss these things in closed groups, and also to make very popular and very well produced media about these types of things that are available for people to watch, listen to, and agree with. And these are just a couple of examples. History Debunked is a very famous, very right-wing person who creates this kind of media, and Survive the Jive is a very, very well-known fascist activist who is also very, very keen on archaeology and heritage, and has made a series of videos about that, and is also very heavily involved in the pagan movement, or certainly heathen pagan movement. Could I have the next slide, please? The importance of archaeology and history to the far right cannot be underestimated. And this is just an example from the weapon that was used to massacre people in Christchurch at the shooting in the mosque there. This is what it looked like, and it has got famous battles of Westerners against Islamic forces from the Ottoman Empire and so on written on it. It's obviously instrumentalizing the past to justify activities in the present. Can I have the next slide, please? And again, activities around organisations like Woden's-folk and the Odinic rites. These are active heathenry organisations that are based in North America and in the UK. They have also been attending activities at archaeological sites in the UK since at least 2019 and creating events and rites at these places, claiming some kind of relationship between their white supremacist beliefs and the identity of the people who created these sites and performed rites there in prehistoric period. So again, that this stuff is sort of very, very firmly entrenched within the far right. Can I have the next slide, please? And these are some examples of the types of sort of everyday far right material that is available. And I'm going to talk about one particular type of far right material that is available in the Searchlight archive. But the types of stuff that people get access to leans very heavily on the past. It uses archaeological sites, it uses historical activities, people, landscapes, you name it, folklore, to create a relationship between people of today, the present political issues, and the past, explicitly and implicitly. Can I have the next slide, please? And one of the reasons why we can start to think about what this might mean in terms of the power that sits behind these types of appropriations is that archaeology itself has a very, very long history of racism, white supremacy, of being used as a framework to support some extreme, imperialist, nationalistic political movements. History and archaeology has been used to make claims for occupation of territories, to establish direct links between contemporary populations and past populations. And in England, like everywhere else, a lot of 19th century archaeologists were involved in eugenics. They developed archaeological methods that were explicitly based on the sort of assumption that white people were more culturally developed than people in other parts of the world. So everywhere from Egyptology to the Deutsche Ahnenab of Nazi Germany, archaeological data and narratives have been used for political purposes. But what sits at the bottom of this is not necessarily scientific fact. What sits at the bottom of this use is, as David Lowenthal talks about here, is the fact that they may not need to be historically accurate. These myths may not need to be archaeologically, scientifically examined and understood. What matters is the psychological weight of these things. So there's a type of emotional infrastructure that sits underneath the relationships that we have as present day populations to the idea of the past. And these can be and have been used to support explicit ethno-nationalist identities. And we can start to think about the ideas of the past that evoke emotion, things like nostalgia, the First World War, pride in being British, pride in the flag, a sense of collective belonging. And we're trained into this sense of an emotional connection with the past from a very, very young age, in that if you think about the average experience of going to a normal state school in the UK, you're involved in things like Saints' Days and Remembrance Days. And if you go to Brownies, you do that type of activity, and your local history is something that you're very familiar with. And history is still presented in very, very specific ways in TV, in books and so on. So could we have the next slide, please? And this is just a selection. Film, TV, going back 20, 30 years, still makes an association between ancestral populations in the UK, historic populations in the UK and ancestors. There is still an idea that we are inheriting something from the people who existed in the past without that relationship necessarily being discussed in scientific terms. There's still a mythology that attaches itself to this. And the concept of our ancestors is resilient. It does absolutely stand up, despite however many people say stop calling them ancestors. There are books still published called Ancestors. Alice Roberts, stop doing it. We can't get away from this kind of thing because, even films, television, video games, they're producing versions of the past that reflect gender roles, activities that people did in the past, the types of ethnic identities that people had in the past as being a certain way. There's a normativity to that. It is an emotional attachment to those types of things. Museums still emphasize the relationship between geographical location of present populations and history. There is still a sort of a very explicit relationship between material culture and arrows on maps and the movement of peoples, and mythologies that would be better suited to be shut away in a Victorian children's history book are still available in local museums, in regional museums. If a museum has the money, some of the interpretation is improved, but not, that doesn't happen a lot. And so people are still able to access information about the past that makes this connection, this growing emotional infrastructure, really solid, a really solid basis. And it presents the past, this association, this idea of ancestry, as something really normal. It's just natural. It's just there. And it's, it gives the far right this imaginative resource, this sense of mythology, this normality attached to this kind of stuff. It's something that shapes identities, it shapes people's values, and it shapes their emotional narratives, that they can start to sort of feel very, very close to the ideas of the types of people who lived in the landscapes that they do, and have this sense. Now, with the arrival of DNA testing and ancestry DNA testing, this has become even more complicated. The arrival of consumer testing has meant that people are being able to access narratives that are created by ancestry DNA companies like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, who will not have particularly informed understandings of the social implications of some of that data, or the understanding of the complexity and nuance around how you understand genetic data and how you apply the idea of ancient haplogroups and your membership of that based on your DNA, and what having a percentage of a certain type of DNA might mean. So there is, again, this idea of emotions that are very, very strongly attached to a lot of data that is actually absent, missing, misunderstood, misrepresented. Could I have the next slide, please? Organisations even like Historic England and English Heritage use this type of language. We're talking about, how we present our nation's past, and it is still using language about our land, our history, our ancestors, our prehistoric ancestors. And this is really powerful affirmation of that relationship between the unknowable past, inherently unknowable, and the present, and present political realities. So can I have the next slide? I'm sorry that one of the pictures has slipped, but this idea of a historic identity becomes something like a commodity. Identity becomes something that can be performed, it can be packaged up, and it can be sold to people emotionally. So this is a really good bargain for the far right, is to leverage some of this emotional infrastructure, to make use of this, to sell it to people. They're already stepping towards these ideas because they have the education system that's taught them history from a very young age, that's based on probably not very much more than an understanding of sort of progressive numbers of kings and queens and the Corn Laws or whatever. We haven't got a good global history curriculum in the UK. You're talking about people who probably only get their information about archaeology from the TV or from a video game, or perhaps, they've read a book by Alice Roberts or listened to a radio program. Their actual exposure to the complexities, the stories, the really nuanced stuff is zero. So they're really open towards this kind of emotion that is attached to the idea and sense of the past. So the types of narratives that are used are really simplistic in the far right's discussion of the past. And I want to talk a little bit more about this. So can I just have the next slide, please? Oh, that really doesn't help anybody, does it, that slide? Sorry about that. Everything slipped as I made it. So could we go to the next slide first, and then we'll come back to this one. So I'm going to be talking today about some work that I've done on the back catalogue of the BNP magazine Identity. Now, the BNP, for those of you that don't know, that was the British National Party, and it became quite incredibly powerful politically during the early 2000s. It rose to a zenith of power by 2009, I guess. It was led by former National Front activist Nick Griffin, who, for those of you that can remember, has appeared on national TV on Question Time. Now, Nick Griffin is a very interesting person because Nick Griffin has a degree in history and law from Downing College at Cambridge. He also claims to have worked as an archaeologist, but he has a lifelong fascination with archaeology. He's actually from Suffolk. He's from not very far away from here, which is randomly awful to know that he knows some people that I know. The BNP itself ideologically positioned itself as a sort of a palatable public front for ethno-nationalism, trying to get away from the extremist viewpoints of the National Front, as was, becoming very much more about trying to make itself look polished, having good public engagement, having good comms. And one of the outcomes of Nick Griffin's arrival on the scene as the chair in 1999 was the publication of this magazine, Identity. Now, Identity was a subscription magazine that was sent to every single member of the BNP. It lasted in this current format till 2011, when it stopped because Nick Griffin was taken to court. Sorry, my dog is now barking. The magazine itself is about, and this is a quote from the magazine, is about preserving the identity of the traditional inhabitants and cultures of Britain. So the magazine focused on things that were relevant to explicitly British white identity. It included ethno-nationalist critiques of government policies and global issues, but the contents were really core sort of symbolic concerns of the national community, the culture, the way of life of being British. And it's very resonant in the sort of Reform UK period, which we'll come back to, just because a lot of the ideas that we're seeing at the moment in the current politics on the extreme right have been already discussed in the pages of these magazines. The articles themselves are interesting for a number of reasons. They use very, very simple historic narratives. They're very, very, very heavy on rhetoric. There's a lot of reference to research of various quality. They use technical terms to kind of impregnate the content with pseudoscience. They construct this idea of nationhood and mythologize what it is to be British. If you could show the next slide. Sorry, not that one. We don't want to look at Nick Griffin. Keep going. This one, yeah. So a lot of the magazine is about things like our ancestors. There's an enormous amount of reliance on discussions of DNA, heavily reliant on the work of this chap here. If anybody's read this book, In the Blood, God, Genes and Destiny by Steve Jones, who was an actual professor of genetic science, but wrote a complete wackadoodle book about what it was to be British. And they riff on topics that are related to archaeology and history over the years. There is discussion of what is indigeneity. As the science develops around DNA studies and ancient DNA studies, there's more discussion of the relationship between historical peoples, the Celts, most importantly, Anglo-Saxons, and DNA. There's discussion of things like what it is to be Scottish, what it is to be English, why they're the same people, who owns the land, the myths that go along with those types of things. But there is this narrative of victimization of people having their past expunged from the record by academics and historians who don't want to talk about the past with enough whiteness included in it. So the histories are presented as revelations. This archaeology is presented as a revelation. This is the stuff that people wouldn't want you to know about because of anti-white multiculturalism. And if I can go through to the next slide, there should be another example of an identity article that talks about DNA. So they've started to talk about ancient DNA studies and talk about the science that goes along with that. And none of the authors have any archaeological or genetic science expertise. In fact, no notable expertise whatsoever, apart from being a member of the BNP. But they present these key ideas. This is about nostalgia for the lost glory of the ancient people, the ancient past, and the oppression of what they call the indigenous people of Britain. So Nick Griffin made it his life's work in the publication to claim indigenous rights for the white British people. And, you know, he was really committed to the idea of pride in white heritage. He was all about promoting cultural nationalism and a cultural war ever since his student days at Downing College, his activism in the National Front. And he's providing, in these articles that he was writing, Paul Golding was writing, a lot of the other activists in the BNP were writing, are about symbolic cultural content. So they are repeatedly exposing the readership to very similar ideas, very similar stories. It's about familiarizing people with these selected principles of white British exceptionalism. And they're grievance narratives. They're talking about how our history is being forgotten or destroyed or overlooked, at the same time as it's about community belonging. So they're talking about white British history for white British people. And in this scientific, or attempts to provide this pseudoscience, they're trying to become clear about their morality. They're talking about why woke academia won't tell you the truth. Only we are reliable in our truths. So there is an emotion and a repetition at the same time as there is this aesthetic to sell this ideology as a form of understanding identity. So these repeated time and time again discussions, histories, the same people, the same characters from history, whether that's Boudica or Herod the Wake or whoever, are providing these opportunities for this past, this imaginary past, to become ideological incubators for the far right. Could we have the next slide, please? And you can see that they're using an interesting mix of images that are absolutely unrelated to the topics in hand, but give this sense of the past, of ancient cultures. And a lot of this is absolutely unrelated. The other interesting aspect of this is how Nick Griffin and other authors use an idea as sort of a veneer of expertise in the signals that they're giving off in the writing of these things. And you can just about see, I think, there that Nick uses his postnominals MA, the Cambridge MA, which is not an MA. It's like you get an upgraded seat if you're still alive 5 years after you graduate from Cambridge. So it's not an MA. He's not a historian. He's just got a BA, and it was in history and law. But it makes him look like an expert. It makes him look intelligent. So they're using pictures and they're using images alongside these tales. They've got Greek and Roman statues. They've got statues of Anglo-Saxon kings. And these are carefully curated. They're very carefully curated. They're probably unfamiliar to the average reader, right? Nobody really understands what these things are unless you've got a title, and they very, very rarely have a title with them. But they create an aura of pastness, of historicity, and they give a sense of credibility that really far exceeds the content of the article itself. But these aren't sensationalized. These aren't speculative fantasies. These are based in arguments and discussions, and it's interesting to think about the subtlety of the methods that they use in this. The references they use are old academic textbooks. They might use, In the Blood by Steve Jones, in the Celt series, which ran over six issues, and was a really big, hard-hitting piecework by Griffin. He relies really heavily on two textbooks, one by Nora Chadwick and one by Colin Renfrew, Before Civilization, both of which were published in the early 70s. So by the time this was published in 2003, 2004, this was well and truly superseded and out of date. But you wouldn't know that unless you're an archaeologist or unless you understand how academic publishing works. And they're probably the result of Griffin's archaeological courses he did at Cambridge. He may have picked them up and still had them on his shelf. And when the scholarship would have been reasonably up to date, but he's writing from a perspective of the 1970s, the early 1970s, in the 2000s. Repeated claims about genetics use scientific terminology, technical terms. This is used regularly everywhere. So anybody perceiving these, anybody reading these is going to think this is really robust research. You know, somebody really understands what's going on here. And this isn't somebody who knows what's what. They have an insight into this. So by filling the gaps in these narratives with convincing science, they educate the adherents to this ideology, to these new traditions, these special facets of their national community. This is about consolidation of identity, consolidation of their ideology, trying to understand why these histories need to be defended, and why these need to be defended from the other, alien cultures, immigrants, and so on. In 2010, research by the Equality and Human Rights Commission at the time showed that 40% of BNP voters didn't have any formal qualifications. And like most people in the UK, average BNP readers are going to get all of their information from watching TV, watching documentaries, from reading newspapers, from tourism, from going to a castle at the weekend, from reading an interpretation board that may be 20 years out of date, if not more, than through their schooling. So there is a void already there that's waiting to be filled, a void in any foundational understanding of what the past is like and how we can sort of link the present to the past. Should we? How we do it? Why do we do it? And it's useful to think about that and think about uncritical acceptance. Could I have the next slide, please? Just another example of endless Stonehenge being used as an instrument to beat people around the head about identity with. Again, it's you know, used time and time again, if not on the pages of the Daily Mail, in the pages of the BNP. It's really important to the far right, to the right-wing news, as a representation of ancestral relationships. Can I have the next slide, please? And one of the most important aspects of this is this Nick Griffin-led claim to the British people, the white people of the British Isles being indigenous. And these are two quotes from his work and from his publications that span sort of 10 years of the publication itself. And he writes that the people of the British Isles today, the direct descendants of the first pioneers who followed the retreating ice sheets at the end of the last glaciation. Now that is an explicit call to your emotions, to nostalgia for a past you never knew. This is a powerful way of manipulating language for people to feel pride, for people to feel that they have been oppressed, that they have experienced difficulty and oppression, and yet they are resilient. And it's a really, really cunning way to turn this conversation around and make it about the oppression of the white people, affirming your ancient heritage and possession of this land. This is great language. This is a really clever, intelligent use of propaganda. Could I have the next slide, please? And for anybody that can remember the uproar about, the skin color of Cheddar Man, will realize the sort of emotional shock experienced by a variety of extremist groups at the facts that were presented about DNA evidence from a multitude of European burials from this period of time. This is stuff that will be denied and will be refuted because it does not fit that incredibly tender emotional place where the past belongs to the white indigenous people. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, there is a calculated choice being made in the repetition in the magazine Identity of these ideas, these archaeological sites, these historical narratives, because repetition is a powerful tool. Now, In psychology, there's something called the illusory truth effect. Basically, whatever intelligence you may have and whatever education you may have, it has been proven that the more times you encounter a claim, even if it's false, if it's familiar to you, you will find it more believable. And the more you're exposed to this type of information, the more believable you will find it. And exposure alone can create this idea of accuracy, that you will even perceive false information as being accurate. And if you've seen contradictory information, you will still think that the stuff you're familiar with is more likely to be true. So if you think about the repeated exposure that people have got, the readership of the BMP have had to these types of claims in TV, in museums, in documentaries, in publications by Alice Roberts, or even in the pages of BMP magazine, this is going to be seen to be true. And this makes any other views about archaeology or DNA or anything really that might challenge your own views, your own ideological norms, feel false. Whereas what you feel is ordinary and it's believable and it's natural. So this sense that because you see something, because it's something that you've had repeatedly, the simplest and most emotionally satisfying beliefs are going to be the ones that you hold fast to and the ones that you perceive as holding the most truth, whether that's factually correct or not. And truth doesn't have to be true. Could I have the next slide, please? So when we talk about the BMP magazine, you can read the article. There's a lot of appendices in it about the types of articles and the number of articles and the number of illustrations and the images. But in public consciousness, the concepts of ancestry and archaeology have really, really been fundamentally linked for a very, very long time. And biology and nationhood seem to be forged in prehistory. This is stuff that is made in a place in the past that we can never know, but we know because we feel it in our bones. And there's an idea of ancestral populations and modern populations existing together, that we have, have had this mobilized for us by the infrastructure we exist in archaeology, in museology, in the interpretations that people make that reach the Daily Mail headlines. That this stuff is so familiar, so comforting, so nostalgic for a nostalgia that doesn't exist. So the far right mobilization of this type of archaeology and history and ancient DNA is nothing new, because they're not having to step too far forward towards other people to meet people where they are already, right? So we don't challenge this as archaeologists. There is an increase in scholarship on this sort of stuff. The popularity of ancient DNA testing, understanding your human stories and haplogroups by doing a swab and so on, has opened up loads of different fronts for the misunderstanding and misuse of ancient DNA and archaeological evidence to prove where people are from and belonging and nationality and the idea of the nation state in the present. But it's really difficult to see where archaeologists actually become physically involved. Where do we become involved beyond the realms of an archaeological publication that maybe a handful of people will read? And I think that this sort of the idea of this illusory truth effect is really, really important to understand, and how this sort of works with selective understandings of historical information, the repeated emphasis on emotional and resonant events and places and people, whether that's Boudica or whoever, you're appealing to something that is stronger than fact. It's a truth that is resistant, beyond resistance, you know, supremely resilient. And so this type of plausible scientific information can be really easily used. And archaeological narratives themselves can be used to bolster, you know, the authority of some of these ideas. The white supremacist great replacement theory, you know, a lot of ancient British archaeology is discussed in terms that wouldn't be, unfortunately, outside the realms of possibility of being discussed within extreme right groups. And this seems to be relatively unchallenged in the archaeological sector. And extremist organisations in the past have said that, you know, understanding how we leverage these types of narratives are really important. And Nick Griffin says in issue 44, so this is partway through the run of Identity magazine, he said, we've got no more than 20 years to avoid fighting and losing a civil war meaning in the UK amongst white people and immigration, and seeing the ancient book of Albion closed forever, a poetic way of saying that we have either got to fight for our past or we will see the eradication of our culture forever. We look at the propaganda of the Reform Party, Reform UK today, and we have a party that is presenting, you know, a moral panic around white identity, that multiculturalism and immigration are threats to white British heritage and identity, and the idea that an increase in Islamophobia or anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant hate crimes is a result of these media-inflamed culture wars. So can we have the next slide, please? These are actual party political choices, that this identitarian politics is not removed from our concerns as people that are concerned with heritage and archaeology. This may seem trivial, this idea of these misrepresentations might seem trivial, but archaeology can be used for malign purposes. We've got to think about the possibilities of some of this stuff finding its way to places like Christchurch, where, you know, historic events were written onto guns that killed people. And whether it's the weaponization of archaeological data or ancient DNA data, we have to think about the impact that this has on our communities and what we can do about this as archaeologists, and how we go about combating the misuse of archaeological evidence and the misuse of ancient DNA evidence in the face of this idea of an illusory truth. And I think that's really the challenge for us, especially for public archaeology, and understanding how people receive archaeological information and the types of interventions that we can make that would change people's perceptions when that emotional infrastructure is so very strong and so very impermeable. I just want to go to the next slide. This is where it ends up. These are some photographs from the riots. You know, this would have been absolutely horrifying if you were in the community there. And even at the moment, there are people in Northern Ireland who I understand are being barricaded in places because they are immigrants in towns with problems going on. Could we have the next slide? I did most of my research at the Searchlight Archive. There are boxes and boxes and boxes of material that I haven't even touched. And if anybody wants to do research on archaeological themes in this type of far-right extremist material, there is years worth of research to be done. This is not an isolated case, it's an example. And the far-right are inflamed by this stuff. I think our challenge is to take this seriously. But I will leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lorna. Obviously, I hope you can see all the silent applause. Um, and yeah, that was really wonderful. Really, really well put. And I think, oh, there you go, some actual silent applause. And I think, yeah, definitely provided sources of action and hope, but also some really sobering things to think about. So we are now going to proceed to our Q&A. I will stop screen sharing now. And I will start us off. Oh, just a reminder, um, we will be running the Q&A, so you can either do a raise hand in Zoom, and Dan will unmute you to ask your question, or if you prefer not to say your question out loud, you can just put it in the chat. We do have a couple of questions that were really helpfully written in beforehand. That hopefully we can get to one or both of them. Yeah, so just to start off, Lorna, someone's asked, what training do you think archaeologists and people working in heritage more generally, including in government, the commercial archaeology, and in media sectors, is needed to help them communicate more carefully, effectively?
I think understanding the implications of language use, and I don't think it would necessarily have to be anything too complicated. I mean, you know, direct relationships between the past and the present are inherently dodgy and dangerous in these cases. You know, do we really need to be training people to do this? It seems quite simple just to not do it, or to think really carefully for yourself about what are the implications, what are the further implications if I write a book called Ancestors, or if I write a book called Meet the Ancestors, or whatever. You know, that I think that, yeah, just the implications, understanding the implications of your language. And I've never met an archaeologist who isn't intelligent enough to work that sort of thing out themselves.
I really like that take of yeah, holding ourselves accountable rather than needing to rely on a like a some force above us to regulate us. Um, I can't see another question yet in the chat, so I might be really cheeky and ask one of my own. Um, I think you implied and really effectively communicated that there's something of a tension between the narratives being put forward by the far right, which are fundamentally simple and emotive and effective. And as in that Lowenthal quote, that the idea that these myths of the past, it doesn't need to be true to carry a psychological weight. That a lot of it's aesthetics of the past, or of pastness generally. If you'd like to coin a phrase, I imagine I didn't coin that phrase, but of pastness generally. There's a tension between that and I think what has sometimes come up in current responses to that problem, which is kind of an implied role of archaeologists as kind of just challenging misinformation as kind of arbiters of truth. So there's a tension between like kind of a lack of a need for truth for them to be effective, and archaeologists' responses being all about truth and making the truth true. I think you spoke on that already, but I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts again on how you feel we can respond to that tension and that kind of issue, if that makes sense.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because I don't think archaeologists, no, I don't think anybody self-respecting archaeologist would claim to know the truth. I think archaeology is inherently ambiguous and nuanced. And I think that perhaps the challenge is to present that ambiguity rather than, you know, how do you challenge an emotion? I think that's really where everything that we do is going to cause struggle, because yeah, it's in the blood, literally. It feels so deep inside people that they have this relationship to the past, you know, imaginary emotional relationship. How do you challenge that as a professional archaeologist? I don't know. I really don't know. If anybody has any answers to that.
I think that's very well put. And yeah, if someone does have a response, yeah, I think my air quotes around truth were too low down. Um, but yeah, so I think we'll go first with a question from Hannah Moots, and then we'll go on to Helen, your question in the chat. Dan, if you can unmute Hannah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. This was really wonderful. I'm an ancient DNA researcher, and I was hoping to ask you for advice about how to engage with people like this. Online, I had a spat with what's his name? The Survive the Jive person that you mentioned. Yeah, exactly. He posted about yeah. Okay.
Yeah, he's done it to me. He's really horrible. Yeah.
Absolutely. And he was posting not about something we published, but about something that someone else published, and I felt qualified to speak on it. But then it was hard. It was like, am I giving him attention by responding, right? Or I don't know. So yeah, do you have advice about how to respond without like feeding them or fanning the flames? Yeah.
It's interesting because I was having this conversation earlier with Jacob and Dan, and we were talking about what you should do. And I'm old school, and I don't think you should platform fascists. So I would not want to have anything to do with them, and I would not continue a discussion. Other people's approaches is to challenge and discuss and debate. I think it depends, and I think it's very different as well. I think as a woman in a space where it can be unsafe, I think that's a dangerous thing. I think you should always, when talking to people, consider your safety first. And I think that has to be the prime. When engaging with the extreme right, you have to think about your own personal safety, because they are sophisticated doxers and incredibly good at finding out where you live and blah blah blah. So, you make that decision about what you're comfortable with, but for God's sake, be careful.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
I thought we could quickly go over Helen's question in chat, and then we'll jump to the two people raising hands there. So Helen's question was, thank you for the brilliant paper. I'm currently working on a project treating the appropriation of classical Greco-Roman antiquity by the contemporary far right, and wondered if this is something that ever came up in your source base, aside from the general use of classical imagery in the article on Boudica, for example.
Oh yes, absolutely. They love a bit of classical Greek and Roman statuary, and they love anything like that. It's interesting because they really don't like the fact that in the UK the Romans beat the beat the Celts in their simplified version of history, but they also like them because they had an empire and nice uniforms. So it's a tension of conqueror and conquered and culture. It's really interesting. But Helen, if you want to get in touch with me, I can send you some stuff because I've got loads of pictures of the articles themselves that would be relevant for you.
Again, thank you so much. And we'll go to Sarah now, I think.
That's great. Thanks, Lorna. That's really lovely paper. I mean, lovely in the sense of really fleshing out a lot of the stuff in your written paper as well. The question I wanted to ask was about that sort of contemporaneity of the knowledge base that Griffin is working from. You were talking about him using those 1970s textbooks from his own undergraduate, which you see a lot, to be honest, not just in far right. Yeah. But then adding into that some, as far as one can tell, completely mangled version of contemporary DNA research. So he's aware that the scientific research is changing. Do you think that he's aware that the archaeological research is changing? He just can't be, but he doesn't want to follow that route? Or do you think that there is a perception that because history has already happened, that our understanding of it is or should be fixed?
I think he's far cleverer than and sophisticated, and so I think he's understands full well about the academic publication cycle and how most new archaeological works would not be published in a book until, you know, they've sort of reached popular, you know, the amount of popularity that would mean you could have a Penguin book or whatever. But I think it's just laziness, and I think he assumes that his readership is not going to know any better or any different, and challenging any of the, you know, discussions that happen post 1973. There's quite a huge 50 years of evidence that is going to completely change the direction those books were going in. It's just too much to write into an article that he's probably spent 10 minutes writing. So I think he's a very sophisticated thinker in his propaganda. I don't think he's necessarily interested in providing actual evidence unless it fits the ideology. It has to fit that ideology, which is why it would never work for him to go and look at an archaeological journal and find something in antiquity, for example, and, you know, use that evidence. It's too much like hard work, and it doesn't necessarily fit a very simplistic frame.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lorna. Thank you so much for that question and for that insightful answer. We have Ray Hackler or Nick Fitzgerald next.
Oh yeah, hello. Hello. Yeah, thanks for the talk. It's me. It's not Ray. Sorry. But I'm I'm just kind of curious because it seems to me that kind of one of the things that that we kind of need to talk about is that kind of like warm, fuzzy feeling of kind of belonging, connection to sites, places, people. And I suppose I kind of wanted to put it out to people, like how we, like for the vast, like most of the people on this call are archaeologists. Sorry, Ray. But like, so we have a kind of, you know, quite a big sense of this. We do it the whole time. You know, to the point where we have quite strong relationships with places, people. Like, you know, I get very, very frustrated about the people that I research for my PhD, for instance, and why they just decided to dump loads of burnt rocks everywhere for no apparent reason. And that's really bothersome to me. And I have quite a deep personal relationship with these people, even though I don't really consider them to be my ancestors and things like that. So how I wouldn't necessarily describe it as, you know, kind of like as an accurate connection or a kind of necessarily even a meaningful one in actual factual terms. But I suppose the question is, how might we be able to get across a sort of, I suppose, a less harmful variation of that connection with the past and with those people? Because I think it's one of those things that's like we all feel it. I doubt anyone would be doing archaeology if they didn't feel it, because let's face it, the money's not exactly fantastic. So kind of like, yeah, I'd just be kind of curious for your take on that, just in terms of how, you know, as I said, everyone has these little kind of connections. How do we go about kind of putting that out there?
This is an interesting topic, and I think it's something that Sarah, Katie, and I have talked about for years. I remember us having discussions for going back 10 years or more, and I think one of the conclusions was that we talk about our shared humanity and what it is to experience living life and the mundanities that both people in the past experienced and people today experience. And especially when working with kids, that's a really good in for connecting people with the past or connecting children with the past. You know, everybody likes to know that people in the past went to the toilet and, you know, what they ate and things like that. But I think that there is you can create some sort of sense of emotional connection through understanding shared humanity with people in the past without having to identify with them as part of your ancestral DNA. I don't know if Sarah actually wants to.
Oh, sorry. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to talk there.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Thanks, Lorna. We have talked about this question many times, and I mean, I do think, you know, my position now is more in heritage studies than it is in archaeology, and you know, heritage in all forms does rely on emotion, but doesn't have to do that through ancestry. And when you do connect with people around the concept of shared humanity, and you can actually use that itself is a counter. I mean, I think that's the point you're making there, isn't it? That it actually is a counter to what the right are doing, because we remind ourselves that humans are the people that we're connected to. And even though they lived a very different life from us, even though they might have looked different from us, their clothes look different, their ways of being were different, but we're all humans, and we can have respect for each other and feel a connection with each other. And you know, that's what I've always found is the best emotional counter, you know, is precisely to and also in relation to that, I remember very strongly with a lot of first year undergraduates in particular, when I was teaching in Ireland, that if they've come through a school which teaches them very strongly normative views, coming across the fact that people in the past lived differently to us was quite liberating for them as well. You know, people who lived here, but they weren't like us. Amazing. You know?
Yeah, it's
oh, sorry, Nick, you carry on your thoughts.
Sorry, boss. It was interesting. I was at a place in Lyra near Denmark, the big experimental archaeology place at Sagenlandet recently. I got into a conversation with one of the guys there who basically does a lot of like Danish Iron Age reconstruction. So she poses as a as a Danish Iron Age woman and takes kids in and takes them around her village and sacrifices things in the bog with them, and she's actually writing a PhD at the moment. We should really get in touch with her. But anyway, but yeah, her entire thing was basically also about involving people with everything. So you have the smells, the kind of tastes, the kind of physical sensations, all of this kind of stuff, so that you have that connection to the mundanity, because that's really difficult to put across. Is, you know, as somebody who does quite a lot of experimental stuff myself, like working with a lot of kind of physical techniques and things, you do get that connection to something that on paper sounds quite boring or dry or something like that. So yeah, I think there may be, you know, some really interesting work to be done there in terms of like outreach using kind of more holistic kind of means. But anyway, I'm not going to take up more time here because I'm aware that there's even more people to get through. So, but thanks anyway.
So we've got, I think, one more question in the chat to read out. So that's from Ben Elliott. He says, thank you. Brilliant stuff, Lorna. I have a tediously specific question for you. Are you aware of the BMP setting academic reading lists that went alongside Identity magazine? I've heard tell that several turn of the century edited volumes on British Mesolithic research were bought up by BMP members following Griffin's since the retreat of the last glaciers statements, hence why they were out of print during my student years. Do you know if this was the case?
Having read every issue bar 4 of Identity magazine and looked in 3 different archives at them, I've never found that, but I wouldn't put it past them. But I also would say that it would probably be a very, very niche group of people, because there were probably about 8 people that were writing regularly for Identity magazine throughout the 10 years it existed. Yet none of whom sort of had a brain cell to rub together. But I can't imagine they would read about the Mesolithic. But, you know, I don't know. I would ask Dan Jones at the Searchlight Archive, because he's the archivist there and he knows everything about everything to do with the far right. He's definitely worth talking to. But I've never seen anything in the boxes, and there's never been anything like even in the fresh editions with any pullouts.
Thank you so much, Lorna. I think just looking at the time, we might have to leave questions there. I'm afraid. Um, but the yeah. So just one more time, thank you so much, Lorna, for your time, for your wonderful paper, and for your and for your patience and for your thoughts. And thank you, everyone else. There were some really, really insightful comments, and I particularly loved that we got onto those themes of exploring kind of like effective and lateral and public facing ways that we as archaeologists can get involved with challenging um, a lot of these kind of narratives. And following on from that, if there's anybody who wants to learn more or wants to get involved with ARFA, we really are at the early stages, and if anybody has any, we're trying to run blog posts, we're trying to do seminars, so if anyone's interested, or has any campaigns, also obviously want to get involved with campaigns, so if there's any campaigns, please do get in touch with us. Dan has put the website in the chat, which also has our email on there, so our Blue Sky, and you've also all got our email now because otherwise you wouldn't be here. So yeah, do that. We are very excited to announce that we are hoping to have Professor Howard Williams, who a lot of you will be aware of. I think the vast majority of you will be aware of as someone who's very much on the forefront of this conversation, particularly in terms of kind of digital discourse. Around this, and he's hopefully doing a seminar for us in the very near future. So keep an eye on our on channels for that, and also keep an eye much sooner for a video recording of this seminar that will be going up. It will be a YouTube link that will be shared on our Blue Sky and our website. So if there's anybody that you want to share Lorna's fantastic talk with, please, yeah, keep an eye out for that. So one more time, thank you so much, Lorna. Um, Big round of silent applause. Um, Thank you everyone for your questions, and we will see you very soon, I hope. Okay.
Thanks all. Take care. Have a good evening.